Start today. Feel free to stop on by the Science Center any day of the week. 6 days a week, so Monday through Saturday, we're open 9:30 to 5. On Sunday, we're open 1 to 5. So today, we're actually going over one of my favorite groups of dinosaurs, the Abelisaurs. The Abelisaurs were discovered by Rubario Abel, and when you discover the earliest of a group of dinosaurs, you have the option to name them after yourself, and you took it. So the Abelisaurs are kind of a weird group of dinosaurs. They are related to the Jurassic Ceratosaurs, which we'll go over eventually. But you'd find Abelisaurs going all the way back into the mid-Jurassic, 170 million years ago, and all the way up until 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs went extinct. They weren't as widely spread as some of the more recent dinosaurs we looked at. You typically only found Abelisaurs, for the most part, in the southern hemisphere, so South America. You'd find a little bit in South America, Europe, Africa, a little bit in Asia. They were typically found in habitats that would have been a bit more isolated, so islands or land masses where other types of carnivorous dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurs weren't living. Tyrannosaurs really did dominate a lot of the Cretaceous ecosystem, so where they weren't, other dinosaurs tended to fill those niches. They could get pretty big still. Just for reference, Tyrannosaurus rex typically maxed out at around 40 feet. The largest Abelisaur got to around 36 feet, so not that much smaller. And the smallest on record was about 17 feet long. And another kind of cool thing about these, for a Cretaceous theropod, it was weird that they weren't feathered. By that point, Coelurosaurs, really, the feathered ones, really did dominate most ecosystems. And it was weird that these guys were still around. So, another thing about Abelisaurs that's kind of fun is they were kind of weird just for their time. So they had 4 fingers on their hand, not 3 like most carnivorous dinosaurs did. It was more primitive condition. Dinosaurs in the Jurassic more often had 4 fingers on their hands. Another thing, just to go over some of the basics of them, they were still Saurischian theropods, so they aren't a totally different group of dinosaurs. Another thing they're known for, which often gets overlooked because of T-Rex, these guys had ridiculously small arms on average. In fact, the dinosaur with the smallest arms relative to its body size was Carnotaurus. If you could zoom in on this drawing of the skeleton, so there's a little thing with the camera. So right here, I drew the anatomy of the arm. They almost entirely lost most of the bones in their hand. These are the radius and ulna, these bones right in this part of the arm. And that is the humerus. Their arms were also not that long. A T-Rex's arm is about as long as my arm. This arm may be half that. And Carnotaurus was about a 30-foot animal, so that's really small. So the other thing about them that was interesting, scientists were looking at their bones, and they actually cut open a few of them to look at how they grew. These dinosaurs were also relatively slow-growing animals. It took them a longer time to get to adult size, which does say they may have lived a little bit longer than we expected, or they just didn't stay at that peak adult size for that long. And again, like I said, they often lived in isolated places, but they also, it seems to be, hunted really large prey. The way their skulls were built, which we'll get into in a second, and the other animals we found in their ecosystems were relatively large. They lived alongside some of the largest animals ever to live, and these guys may have hunted some of them. While not being the biggest carnivores, they were pretty tough. So, talking about ones that lived in isolated places, Majungasaurus is one I always like to highlight. So this, I kind of like to call it the king of Madagascar. Lived around 70 million years ago, up to the end of the Cretaceous. And Madagascar, by that point, was already an island, and it had a relatively isolated ecosystem. There were a few Titanosaurs in that ecosystem, but for the most part, it was a smaller number of species. And this was the largest carnivore, and that'd be this one up here, in that ecosystem. Being just almost 25 feet long. So a little bit smaller than a lot of theropods in the Cretaceous. But it was estimated to be up to maybe 3,300 pounds. It's very, very heavy for that size. And they had proportionately shorter legs, which kept them lower to the ground, and the legs were stockier, meaning they were able to probably drag other animals and pull them down kind of closer to their height to keep that prey animal off balance. Other kind of interesting thing, when you live in a very competitive, very isolated ecosystem, food can be in short supply. In nature, cannibalism is not unheard of, and in dinosaurs, this is the first dinosaur we actually had concrete evidence of cannibalism for. They probably would, if you saw a dead Majungasaurus as a Majungasaurus, just kind of see it as a meal. The other thing that's kind of cool about them, so I mentioned these animals probably hunted large animals. The way we can tell that is their cranium, unlike a lot of other carnivorous dinosaurs who didn't have fully fused skulls, they're still sutures, Majungasaurus had a fully fused cranium. All those bones were fused together, which gave it a really good rigid structure, which was durable for force that would be exerted on during hunting. Now, Abelisaurs also had another kind of cool thing about their jaws. Their lower jaws were kind of flexible, like a snake's, meaning that if they bit onto a large prey animal, it could move around a bunch, and that lower jaw could kind of flex and move with it, not putting the animal at risk of literally having its jaw broken. And another thing about Majungasaurus is it had this one horn on its head, on top of this big kind of nasal bump. Which a lot of people think this may have been a display organ of some kind, and they're often reconstructed with soft tissue displays like turkey waddles, which I'd kind of put one on this one too, because I think it kind of looks fun. They are kind of a good example of what happens when animals live in isolation. They really do specialize. This animal was specialized for its ecosystem. It probably wouldn't do that great somewhere else, but it didn't have to. So the other Abelisaur I want to talk about today is probably the most famous one, and that is Carnotaurus. It literally means meat-eating bull. It was known for having these two big horns on its head. If you can zoom in on that silhouette, it had a really weird body shape. It's often been jokingly described as a hot dog with legs. Carnotaurus and Abelisaurs in general, if you look at the general head shape on the drawing, if you want to zoom in on the head, their skulls are about as tall as they are long. And while sacrificing a bit of leverage with that, what it did do is give them a little bit sturdier of a head, so they could really put themselves under a lot of force. So Carnotaurus has also often been described kind of as the cheetah of the Cretaceous. They had these very long, slender legs and a very large, muscular tail. And those muscular tails are actually where the muscles for the thigh attached, which allowed these dinosaurs to run at really great speeds. They had also the smallest proportional arm of any dinosaur at just about 1.5 feet long. Carnotaurus was about 30 feet and maybe 1.35 tons. And the other big question about this one is, why the horns? It's really unheard of today to have horns on a carnivorous animal. And a lot of people think that the horns on Carnotaurus were actually used for what we call intraspecific conflict, or combat, where animals of the same species compete with each other. A lot like goats and sheep do today, where they will headbutt each other. A lot of people think these horns are used for some sort of a similar purpose, maybe for headbutting, or a lot of people think they would basically push their heads together and then try to push the other dinosaur. That could have been when there was food around to see who got to keep that food. It could have been during mating season, we're not sure. The other thing that's kind of cool about Carnotaurus, while it is only known from one good skeleton, it's a skeleton that also has skin impressions. So this is how we know these dinosaurs were, for the most part, not feathered. They have great impression of the scales on this animal. And I did look it up to see if we knew what color these ones were, like we did with the Dromaeosaurs, the Ceratopsians, the Ankylosaurs. And it seems to be that they haven't yet put them under any analysis to see those smaller cellular structures. But I look forward to seeing if they do, because it's kind of interesting when we have so much of an animal to look at, we can get these very clear pictures of what they did. So the other thing is, again, very specialized for running out very quickly and grabbing at prey. These would be hunting, again, very large animals, so what a lot of people think they would do is they would run out, make a bite on a predator, or on a prey animal, run away, come back again, and basically just wear a prey animal down. And being fast enough where the prey animal doesn't have time to do anything about it. Because by the time they're like, oh, I've been bit, the predators run away off into the underbrush. Since they were hunting such large animals like Titanosaurs, which were a type of sauropod. And it's a really effective niche that you don't see that many of today, just due to the fact there isn't such a wide disparity between the size of the prey and predators in modern ecosystems as there was in the Cretaceous and the time of the dinosaurs. So one of the things people often ask is, why out of all the dinosaurs at this time were these scale? So these dinosaurs mostly lived in the southern hemisphere, which was hotter at the time. The Cretaceous was already a very warm time to live, but the southern hemisphere being that much hotter also meant that animals living there had to deal with extreme heat. Meaning, you need some way to vent the heat, and that layer of feathers would actually be a disadvantage to them. Where it would have been an advantage for dinosaurs that lived in the northern hemisphere, where it could get quite a bit colder. So, a few things I want to talk about is, so what does isolation do to populations? So one thing with a lot of Abelisaurs, they aren't actually the size of the two dinosaurs we discussed today. A lot of them are somewhat smaller. They lived on islands. So there are a couple rules in biology, which is when animals, large animals, find themselves on islands in populations, those animals tend to decrease in body size, as it's easier to support a smaller body. Whereas when small animals get onto islands, they actually tend to get a little bit bigger. And that is mostly because they aren't under the pressure to hide from as many predators often, so they can afford to have a slightly larger, basically, body mass. Another thing that can happen with isolated populations, which is one thing that they think happened to Majungasaurus a little bit, is potentially you have a smaller gene pool overall. So if you live on an island, you just can't fit as many animals. So inbreeding was always a danger. So these populations are often very subject to, basically, if there's a sudden decrease in the population, becoming too inbred actually to biologically continue functioning. It's called genetic meltdown, and they think it happened to some animals in history like the Wrangel Island woolly mammoths. The other thing is intraspecific combat. It's very common, not just in mammals, but in birds. You will often see that. You sometimes, like with mammals, like with bighorn sheep, you even get a full-on body part evolved specifically for intraspecific combat, and that is what they think big horns are on Carnotaurus. But overall, these are one of my favorite dinosaurs just because they don't get talked about that much. They get a bit overshadowed by stuff like Spinosaurus, Dromaeosaurs, Tyrannosaurs. But they're still rather interesting animals. And they have some very unique features that they don't look like anything else from the time they lived. Does anyone have any questions about these at all?
They have good eyesight or good hearing?
So that's one with Carnotaurus. Given that they found a mostly complete animal, they do have a good estimation of eyesight and stuff. So they had relatively small eyes, which they think was partially to help with the horns if they were doing intraspecific combat. A smaller eye is less likely to, get, a Christmas Story, you'll put your eye out. But they do think they had very good eyesight still. The size of the eye wasn't really hindering their vision. They actually think that these animals were really good at essentially moving their heads around while they were running because they couldn't turn that well. So they would be able to kind of keep track of their surroundings by moving their head. So they probably did have pretty good eyesight, at least that one did. We can't quite say for the ones we don't have the evidence for. The other thing is, when we say fast for a dinosaur, they are relatively large animals, so 30 miles an hour is what we consider fast. Modern animals that can hit 30 miles an hour would be stuff like wolves. So it's not excessively fast compared to modern animals, but for an animal that weighs, almost 2 tons to run 30 miles an hour is kind of an achievement. Any other questions about these? But yeah, so next week we will pick up with another herbivore.